Tuesdays with Dr. Daniel Vivian, who is Associate Professor and Chair, Department of Historic Preservation at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky. He has his BA in History from the University of Alabama. He saw the error of his ways and then came to the University of South Carolina. So we corrected that. He did an MA in Public History. And then, unfortunately, kept traveling north and did an MA in History at Johns Hopkins University.
Hey, be nice.
That's
okay. Some of us are from Baltimore.
Yeah, that's right. I see that on your license. And a PhD in History from Johns Hopkins University also. Previously, Daniel served as an assistant professor at the University of Louisville. He served as a historian for the National Register of Historic Places with the National Park Service. He was a Historic Property Survey Coordinator back here in South Carolina, Department of Archives and History. In 2018, he published a book, and the book is entitled The New Plantation World, The Sporting Plantations of South Carolina, Lowcountry, 1900 to 1940. And it's on that topic that he's going to be speaking today. Will you join me in welcoming Daniel?
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Morning.
So it is a great pleasure to be here with you. This has been a long time in planning because when Bob first contacted me, I begged that we do this after the spring semester ended and I'd be a little bit more focused and attentive than I would be if I was trying to finish up grading and everything. But it's always great to be back in the Lowcountry, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about my work. What I want to do this morning is sort of give you an overview of what my recent book is about. It grows out of my dissertation, and it really grows out of an offhanded comment 20 years ago when I was working with the State Department of Archives and History. So I was the survey coordinator. I worked a lot with the person who was then the National Register coordinator, Andy Chandler, wonderful man, very, very good architectural historian, Kingstree native, very much a South Carolinian, and we had gone to a public meeting over a fairly controversial historic district nomination that was pending in Berkeley County, and driving back one evening to Columbia, Andy knows everything about every building and most aspects of South Carolina history. So, and he also has one of those wonderful Lowcountry accents. Apparently when he went to conferences in the North back in the 80s and 90s, people would say, talk for us, Andy, just talk. Hear you speak. So Andy was talking as we were driving back that one evening, and he was talking about some of the properties that were in this fairly controversial rural historic district in Berkeley County that had been proposed. And he said at one point, yeah, and then in the 1920s, all the rich New Yorkers came here and bought them up. And he's referring to plantation lands along the Cooper River and elsewhere in Berkeley County. And I thought that was such a weird phenomenon and such an odd thing to have happen, because as a student then working on my master's in Southern history, 1920s are not a good time for Southern agriculture. They're especially hard here in South Carolina. For farmers in the South and farmers in most parts of the United States, the Depression really begins after World War I. I mean, commodities prices tank, and it's pretty rough, and then it gets even rougher. So the notion that people would be willingly and sort of energetically buying plantation land struck me as really, really odd. And so I started looking into this phenomenon. And so what the book really does is tackle on a region-wide scale the question of what's become kind of popularly known as the Second Yankee Invasion. So I realize that this is, in many people's minds, an ongoing phenomenon, and some of you may be perpetrators thereof, but in the early 20th century, and especially in the 20s, and by the early 1930s, people in the Lowcountry are actively referring to a second Yankee invasion, specifically talking about very wealthy people, mainly from northern cities, mainly New York, Boston, a few from Baltimore, a few from Philadelphia, but an awful lot of New Yorkers buying coastal lands for recreational purposes. And the scale of land acquisition and the prices being paid, and then what they do with those lands really does trigger this sort of immediate sense of change. And so people start talking about this phenomenon very, very clearly and distinctly. It gets tremendous coverage both in local newspapers, but then also in national newspapers and magazines. So it's a big deal. And then so what my book does is look at this phenomenon on a region-wide scale. There's an awful lot of knowledge within the region about this. I mean, most people who've lived here for some time know about it. They know of particular estates that were acquired during that period. There have been a fair number of books and articles written about individual plantations, but my book is the first one to look at it throughout the Lowcountry and to sort of ask the big question, why does this happen? There's lots of places where you can buy relatively inexpensive land if you're a wealthy northerner in the teens and 20s. Why would you do it on the South Carolina coast? There's not a comparable phenomenon in either North Carolina or coastal Georgia. There's some, but not the same sort of intensity. Florida is, of course, the real destination, the kind of boom state, the sunshine state that becomes a destination for well-to-do northerners and a real resort enterprise. So I wanted to understand, why coastal South Carolina? Why not other seemingly comparable plans in adjacent states? This is a really wonderful quote from journalist Chalmers Murray, who writes a lot for the News and Courier about this phenomenon and some of the estates acquired, and gives you kind of a taste of how people are talking about it. And this is very tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless illustrative. The other thing that the book does is sort of interrogate the world that wealthy northerners who buy these old plantation properties and rehabilitate them for new uses, I wanted to understand their world, why they're coming here, what they're doing. Now, the conventional wisdom when I started is, well, there's really good hunting here, a lot of ducks and quail at the time. It's warm during the winter, you don't have snow generally, and land is cheap, right? Okay, so this is the sort of conventional wisdom, but as I started looking at the sources, the people that participate in this phenomenon and the people that are writing about it contemporaneously refer to plantation life as a sort of sphere of activity that has distinct qualities. Now, of course, they never define exactly what those are, but they refer to plantation life as this sort of experience that people from moneyed backgrounds that have bought lands here and they're hosting friends and family. I wanted to understand what they meant by that. Plantation life, of course, for these folks, it's about riding horses and hunting and an awful lot of socializing. And it has a meaning that goes beyond, I think, just the sort of obvious characteristics. It's also a really interesting historical problem, because what does plantation life mean writ large in the contemporary South? It's about sharecropping and tenancy and being poor and marginalized in all sorts of difficult economic and social conditions that during the 30s, people will write about as debt peonage, the #1 national economic problem, southern farming. Now here in the Lowcountry, that's rice rather than cotton, but the general connotation of what plantation life means is not appealing, right? It's not about hunting and riding horses and dressing up in finery and entertaining yourself. So I wanted to understand what plantation life meant for these folks. And then the third thing is, this gives you a taste of, again, just this massive degree of attention that happens as this phenomenon develops. So news articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, Life, Fortune, Country Life, House Beautiful, an awful lot of attention to purchasing of old plantations, rehabilitation of those estates for new purposes, what people do with the houses that are left standing, what they do when they build new houses, who's buying and who they're related to and what their business enterprises are, and then an awful lot of attention in newspapers like the Georgetown Times, the News and Courier, local people really recognize this as important and transformative. And in the broad sweep of Lowcountry history, this is not hard to understand. This is early 20th century for the most part. It's really in the teens and 20s that it begins to attract significant attention. Rice and Seattle and cotton, as the dominant cash crops here, have survived the Civil War, but at greatly diminished output. They both limp along, and things look okay with rice until the 1880s, and then we have the hurricanes of the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. Additional labor strife. It's getting very hard for planters to find labor that's willing to work in the difficult conditions that are the rice fields. And so, by the 19-teens, the rural Lowcountry is dormant. I mean, there's not much going on except for timbering. There's no jobs. It's essentially been, sort of dropped off the register in terms of national consciousness. It's a very, very stagnant place, and people recognize it as such. So this kind of the media attention and the amount of interest this phenomenon stirs up really makes people think about the Lowcountry differently, really restores the Lowcountry to national consciousness in a new way, and brings attention to the region in a way that's strikingly different from recent history. And then, lastly, before I get into details, the other big historical problem writ large is if this is the contemporary experience that most people that are familiar with southern plantations recognize, the other thing is that there's this tremendous mythology about the plantation that's being elaborated. It's well established, but it's being elaborated and given new contours during this period. So, we generally remember Gone with the Wind. The book is published in 1936. The film version is 1939. But the 20s and particularly the 30s have this massive slew of very romanticized writing about the South, and then other Hollywood films that nostalgicize, this aristocratic past. All the men were very handsome and gentlemanly planters. All the female were these beautiful belles, and of course the slaves were very contented and happy to serve these benevolent masters. And everything was much better than it was, much better than it is in contemporary America. So this kind of nostalgia for a romantic past really makes you think about, what are the larger connotations associated with the idea of a plantation? What's the difference between the sort of romantic mythology and what people see themselves as purchasing when they're actually buying a former site of large-scale agricultural production and slave labor? I mean, that's the basic definition of what a plantation was historically in this region and most other parts of the South up to the Civil War. So the story I tell in the book actually has a much longer trajectory than commonly recognized, and it has a distinct chronology, okay? And this is one of the things that I think is important about taking a region-wide approach to the phenomenon. Well-to-do northern men begin coming to the Lowcountry, Georgetown area in particular, but then also places further south, mainly to hunt ducks and quail to some extent, beginning soon after Reconstruction, 1880s, 1890s. This is an established phenomenon by the beginning of the 20th century. And what's going on in big picture terms is an ongoing struggle for access to good shooting lands, diminishing wildlife populations, and the fact that people that are enjoying sport hunting are in competition with market hunters, men that are shooting to sell freshly killed game for urban markets, and then what sportsmen typically refer to as pot hunters, subsistence hunters that are hunting to feed themselves. Hunting is still an elite activity. It takes financial independence and resources to do. Most people are not hunting for sport. There's a status connotation, very strong status connotation associated with hunting for sport, and so it's quite a bit different phenomenon than what we're used to in contemporary America. what these northern hunters, the basic problem these gentlemen have, and again, these are mainly people from New York City, Boston, other major cities in the north, all the lands where you can shoot ducks have been bought up on waterways closer to home. The Chesapeake has been prime for a long time, but hunting clubs have acquired most of the land along the Chesapeake. Market hunters have shot a lot of the wildlife populations there, and so there's this sort of ongoing struggle. And so even before the Civil War, hunting clubs form on the Outer Banks of North Carolina and acquire property there. South Carolina is the next stop. Okay, and so this is part of a sort of developing phenomenon. Now, South Carolina turns out to be especially good quality duck hunting for a couple of reasons that have everything to do with the history of the region. It's on the Atlantic Flyway, but whether rice fields are still active or whether they're idle and flooded, they're really good duck feeding grounds, okay? So conditions in the region, some of which are shaped by the history of the region, some of which are natural, really favor high quality duck populations and attract big populations at a time that competition for access to them is really underway. So there are several hunting clubs that are formed in the 1880s and 1890s. Here, the Annandale Club, the Santee Club, the Murphy Island Club are amongst the earliest. And these are enterprises where 4, 6, 8, 10 men get together, they form a joint stock corporation, they buy in, they have bylaws, it's an incorporated enterprise, and that enterprise, that corporation is founded mainly to acquire land, maintain it, and then allow members to hunt on it for recreational purposes. They often specify whether or not they're allowed to bring guests, and if so, how many. What will be done to maintain wildlife habitat and to plant feed crops to attract wildlife, really quite rigorously controlled. So acquisition of land for recreational purposes, this is not just, gentlemen coming to Georgetown and asking somebody local to go guide them to good hunting lands. It's a very deliberate exercise. By the first decade of the 20th century, I calculated, this is probably a low number, there's about 200,000 acres of coastal South Carolina land that have been bought by these hunting clubs, mainly in the Georgetown area, okay, and then also mainly in the territory near Beaufort, where the Okatee Club, the Pineland Club, the struggled with pronunciation, several different hunting clubs buy property in what's now Beaufort and Jasper counties. And again, very high quality duck hunting. There's better access to quail there. There's still quite a lot of quail though here in this part of the state at the time. So well-to-do hunters come here beginning in the 1880s and 1890s, and they find bountiful game populations. And initially, they either use existing plantation houses that they refurbish a little bit, but really are only concerned with making weather tight, or they start building kind of clubhouses that have some rustic type influences of the kind you see in, for instance, the Adirondacks and some of the lodges of the Great West, and then a lot of shingle style lodges that are in an architecture that's associated with recreation on the coast of Maine and the Berkshires of Massachusetts. One of the things the book does is look very carefully at architecture and landscape as source materials, because what I found as I started doing the research is that to read the kind of assumptions people are making about the activities they're going to carry out, understanding the material environment becomes very, very important. So the point here is that early on, what these hunters are doing is they're importing architecture that they're familiar with, because many of these folks are also hunting in Maine or in the Adirondacks or elsewhere in the north. Shingle style architecture is the architecture of leisure for the upper classes and an emerging middle class. You go to Bar Harbor, Maine today, it's nothing but shingle style cottages and fairly large houses like this. Not until about 1910 do people who have come down with hunting clubs decide that they're going to start buying property individually for their own use. There are, however, at the end of that first decade, a few examples, and at the time, these gentlemen have simply enjoyed being part of these clubs. They're very impressed by the kind of quality of hunting they can get to, and they decide they'd like to have a place of their own, so they've got more land to hunt on, and they've got the ability to bring friends and family. Gravel Hill Plantation is one of these estates, and it too has a shingle-style complex. It's created by a member of the Pineland Club, who's hunted in South Carolina for 20 years at that point, and apparently the complex replicates one that he also owns up in the Adirondacks. So there's a very kind of conscious sensibility about what kind of architecture and what kind of spaces you need if you're coming to South Carolina in this period. The really significant change, or what I see as a turning point, begins in the 19-teens, and there's a couple things that happen here. Now there are hunters that purchase their own land and are still coming down principally in exclusively male settings. And I should step back for a second and say, up to this point, these are exclusively male groups. I mean, hunting is manly sport. It's a very gendered activity. Now there are fair numbers of women hunting, and certainly amongst upper class people, more women are hunting than others. But all of these hunting clubs are exclusively male, with the exception of the Pineland Club in what's now Jasper County. And that's formed as an offshoot of the Okatee Club when some members decide they'd like to have the ability to bring their wives with them. So this is where, you and your hunting buddies go and hang out and hunt during the day and have a big meal at night, and most likely drink a fair bit of liquor in the evening. They're very male spaces, okay? So there's very gendered activity. That changes with a few examples in the 19-teens. So one of those examples is Bernard Baruch, who of course begins buying land here on the Waccamaw Neck. Now Baruch's a little unusual in that he's got familial connections to this region. The Kaminsky clan here in Georgetown are cousins. He was actually born in Camden. So he's a little bit unusual, but nonetheless starts purchasing lands here beginning in 1907, and by the mid-teens, I think he's got about 20,000 acres. J.S. Holiday is a steel manufacturer from Indianapolis. He purchases a place called Nightingale Hall. Robert McCurdy is a wealthy corporate lawyer from New York City, mainly works for railway companies, and he purchases Tomotley Plantation in Beaufort County. And what begins with these purchases is men who are coming for hunting but bring wives and children with them. And so the need for a more comfortable domestic setting, for a little bit more refinement. You're not going to sleep on the floor of some old plantation house. This begins a process of development in material terms where greater attention to the main house on the property, where people are living, and then the surrounding landscape, and the beginnings of sort of a landscape plan that looks more suburban or more appropriate for a domestic setting. Not a lot of effort towards any kind of pretentious architecture, any sort of architecture that displays authority, right? So McCurdy, the house at Tomotley is gone. People in Jasper and Beaufort counties are very quick to mention this gentleman Sherman that destroyed all the houses on plantations there. So he built a kind of rambling bungalow that would have looked appropriate in many northern suburbs of the period. The Kittredge family of New York uses the old house at Dean Hall Plantation, but doesn't do much to it at the time. Baruch's family stays in what they call the Old Relic. This is an 1890 Queen Anne style house that was built by the previous owners of the lands he buys. So there's not a lot of attention to any sort of architecture that conveys status or authority, but nonetheless a kind of new domestic space. The other thing that begins to happen in the teens are some efforts that begin to show reverence for existing architecture in a way that becomes significant later on. So Mulberry Plantation on the Cooper River is purchased by a wealthy stockbroker and his family, Clarence Chapman, in 1915. And this is the first sort of studious, academically correct restoration of a Lowcountry plantation house anywhere in the region. Okay, so what, now it's quite extensive. I mean, they dismantle it in a very extensive manner, but it's dilapidated beforehand. It's still habitable, but it hasn't been occupied in at least 10, if not 20 years. And so the Chapmans hire Charles Brendan, a New York architect, to look carefully at the house, study it carefully, and then rehabilitate it to the appearance it had probably about 1800. Now there are some embellishments. You know, the colonial revival, which is popular during this time, is really about adding ornament to what are believed to be colonial forms, but nonetheless, a very self-conscious restoration of an early and architecturally important Lowcountry plantation house. There's also quite a bit of elaboration. And there's quite a bit of elaboration of early houses that do have some architectural significance in this part of the state, in the rivers around Georgetown, where new owners will try to add to them, build wings or additions in a way that the architecture is sympathetic to the existing architecture. So what develops in part is a sort of respect for colonial and antebellum architecture in a way that's not previously recognizable. Henrietta Plantation is very close to here. It's restored in a very conscientious way by a stockbroker named Schonard in 1929. Friendfield is purchased by a wealthy Philadelphian, Radcliffe Cheston, in 1926, I believe. That house is burned, but he hires a very prominent Philadelphia firm to recreate it as closely as possible. Really good examples of this kind of conscious respect for earlier architecture that develops. The Wedge is also another house very close to Henrietta that's restored during this period, and that it's a wonderful photo in that you get the sense, you know, what wealthy Northerners are finding when they look at Lowcountry lands is, you know, tremendous dilapidation. I mean, by the 19-teens, it's been 10, 15, 20 or more years since these lands have been economically remunerative and productive purposes. The planter families that own them have mainly moved to cities, principally Charleston, and they've gone into law and medicine. I mean, rice planting is not a productive activity. Seattle and cotton lasts a little bit longer, but for the native Southerners, you know, why invest money in the rural Lowcountry given the ongoing trajectory of agriculture in the region? This doesn't make sense. So in the mid-1920s, there's a dramatic shift in activity, and this is what I refer to in the book as a state building phenomenon. And this really coincides with the uptick in attention, both naturally and within the region. But for reasons that are fairly complicated, beginning in the spring of 1925, wealthy, socially prominent people from northern cities began buying coastal lands with really quite a bit of fervor, and immediately creating fairly large, architecturally pretentious estates. Okay, so there's a new sensibility, a new kind of approach that develops right during the mid-1920s, and the intent is to acquire lands and not take sort of a general develop-as-you-go approach, but to immediately either restore the buildings that are there and develop new landscaping, or you hire a prominent architect to design a new big house and associated outbuildings and maybe even a landscape plan and develop it in sort of a grand style. And so, you know, the question is, why all of a sudden the 1920s? There are a couple factors that are worth considering. Number one is Florida. Okay, so the Florida land boom of the post-World War I era, the development of Henry Flagler's estates or resorts on the Florida coast, and other activity there, people recognize, what that does is create a seasonal movement of people from northern cities, principally New York, that are going to winter in Florida, places like Palm Beach and so forth. But communities all up and down the coast recognize this could happen here. If Florida's developing at this pace, aren't they eventually going to come to Georgetown? And people write about it very, very consciously. What this means for people that have bought in earlier periods is that the opportunity to entertain people, to host in upper class fashion, business associates, potential business contacts, people you know through social networks, this goes up dramatically as the transit between northern cities and Florida goes up. So the ability to have a kind of upper class lifestyle that is socially engaged increases exponentially during the 1920s. The other thing is that land for recreational purposes amongst the upper classes is becoming increasingly scarce. Long Island is the main destination for what people term sometimes the great experiment in upper class country living, right? These sort of large grand estates on Long Island. All that land has been bought up by the 1920s. Florida has become pretty well developed, and of course before the crash comes, the land boom kind of tapers off. So by the mid-20s, South Carolina looks really attractive. It's on all the steamship and railroad lines that have been developed and improved upon to get people to Florida. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's even more inexpensive than it has been in previous years because the boll weevil has killed sea island cotton, and so now there's virtually nothing being grown in the region. So the opportunity to buy lands at very inexpensive prices and develop large estates that you're then going to use not just for your recreational purposes, your private recreation, but as a sort of social milieu where you bring friends and business associates and others and show off. This goes up dramatically in the 1920s. So by the end of the 20s, and these are just a few examples, by the end of the 20s, you have over 60 large estates that are under development or in the process of development, and by the end of the following decade, there will be 76 spread throughout the Lowcountry, okay? And people talk about these as plantations, okay? The nomenclature stays the same. And so, if we go back to some of the early newspaper articles, northern citizens returning to their homes, South Carolina plantations. This is an article from a magazine called Country Life. It's exclusively about plantations that are being used for these recreational purposes. Now, what northerners generally do is buy plantation lands and retain the historical name of the productive plantation that's been there. They're also buying a lot more land than is historically necessary for agriculture, okay? So Baruch owns 20,000 or so acres throughout the rest of the period here. His neighbor Isaac Emerson also creates a estate that he calls Arcadia of about 20,000 acres. These are not uncommon. And the basic need here is lots of land for hunting so you don't overhunt wildlife populations, and you've got a diversity of land for different types of recreation. What northerners tend to do, so Mackey Point Plantation is purchased by a wealthy Philadelphia stockbroker, but northerners also aggregate multiple other former plantations they buy into larger land holdings and keep the historical name of the one where they keep their house, which they use as their domestic space. So there's this redefinitional process that flows during this period. It's very, very confusing in historical terms, but it's incredibly important at the time because what you get is a redefinition of plantations as places of leisure and recreation for upper class people, no longer productive estates, no longer places where people of color are doing very difficult labor under difficult conditions, but totally different connotations, but the historical names largely stayed the same. So we're talking about plantations that have roots in the colonial and antebellum periods, but we're talking about them in entirely new ways that really obscure their historical uses. A few examples. I haven't talked much about the people that that are behind this phenomenon, and at the time, I mean, I used the nomenclature that local newspapers and local people use. They talk a lot about Yankees, rich Yankees, Northerners. I mean, there's this very conscious understanding of who's buying, and for the most part, these are all people from northern cities, a few from the Midwest, but relatively few. So Bernard Baruch is, of course, well familiar to everybody here in Georgetown. Isaac Emerson is a wealthy Baltimore pharmaceutical manufacturer. He is Baruch's neighbor. Robert and Ann Goulet. Robert has the misfortune of being heir to a Manhattan real estate fortune that rivals that of the Astors. He has one of those cottages at Newport. He's probably the third or fourth wealthiest man in America at the beginning of the 20th century. They developed Wedgefield, which is just north of here. It's now Wedgefield Golf Course, and the residential development. Archer and Anna Hyatt Huntington are the couple that creates what's now Brook Green Gardens. They buy a number of historical plantations and develop the house, the very unusual house, an exotic house that's now at the state park site there. Thomas and Elise Yawkey. Yawkey is the heir to a lumber fortune, principally a manufacturing fortune, and he purchases what's now most of South Island and he owns the Boston Red Sox throughout the early 20th century, brings people like Ty Cobb and other members of the ball club here to recreate during the winters. Very, very well-to-do people, socially connected. There's a dramatic uptick, so that increase in sort of ambition and land acquisition that happens in the 1920s. Previously, owners are somewhat more modest. Now, there's certainly very, very wealthy people here from the 1890s onward, okay? But for instance, J.S. Holliday, the Indiana steel manufacturer I mentioned, he's not part of the New York social mess. So he's not hobnobbing with people at Palm Beach and in Manhattan during the winter and on Long Island during the summer months. You know, he's well-to-do, but very, very different ambitions. Robert McCurdy, he's somewhat better connected with New York society, but again, not socially prominent. So as a sort of social scene develops associated with winter residency here, the social prominence and pretension of the people involved increases dramatically. And again, it's not just about coming here so you can hunt ducks, although that's still a big part of it. It's about performance for members of the same social set. It's about the upper class rituals that go along with recreational activity and require more developed material environments, much greater pretension. Mulberry, again, is that example of the first restored plantation house in the Lowcountry, but it's also a really good example of the way we're not just talking about the big mansion, we're talking about landscape development that's really pretty substantial in scale. So Mulberry is restored, the main house is restored in 1917, the Chapmans continue to own it, and they're fairly well connected socially, although not like Goulet and some of the others. But in the 1930s, as this estate-making phenomenon continues and builds steam, they decide, well, they've got to keep up with the Joneses, basically, and they develop a landscaping and garden plan. They hire Luttrell Briggs, a Charleston-based landscape architect, to create this large plan. So here's the main house that's been restored. Previously, you know, there's relatively little landscape development. They've got an open lawn in front of the house, but not much else. And so Briggs designs a large circular garden down the slope that's about 300 feet in diameter. He designs a set of gardens that go along the canal overlooking the rice fields. He designs a kind of intimate garden right next to the house for entertaining and relaxing outdoors, a formal motor court. much more pretentious setting for activity. And so this is part of the way, recreational activity becomes more important. You're doing more of it with more people. You're probably going to need a stable to house the horses and other animals you're relying on. Much greater pretension built into the landscape for indoor and outdoor entertaining in the sense of a landed estate rather than simply a comfortable house in the woods. Some really refined examples. One of the things that happens with this estate making phenomenon is, again, the use of established architects from northern cities and landscape designers. So not so much rehabilitation of existing architecture, much more formulaic approaches that are sort of based on upper class tastes of the period. So Wedgefield is a great example, and it's one you can go visit today. The house is more or less intact, although it looks quite a bit different now. But this is designed by, this is Golay's plantation. It's a great example of the evolution because, so Walter Winchester Keith is a Baltimore businessman who buys the estate, buys Wedgefield in 1916, and he's much more illustrative of this first generation. He just likes to hunt. And so he comes down here, and the newspaper reporting on this place says, Keith is very conscientious just to leave things as they are. I mean, he does a little bit to get the kitchen up and running, but the existing house is a small frame building, and he just leaves it exactly as it is. He doesn't want to do anything to the grounds, and he just comes down and hunts. So the article that talks about the Golays purchasing this says, well, Mr. Keith had this small little house, and Robert and his wife tear that down immediately. And so they hire William Bottomley, who's a very prominent New York architect, kind of, Fifth Avenue, very high style, elegant Regency influenced architecture, and he designs the main house in this garden complex. Luttrell Briggs is the one landscape architect that does a lot of work for well-to-do Northerners. There's also a New York firm called Innocente and Webble, who do quite a few estates and more in this area as well as the further southeastern part of the state, and they do the landscape plan for the Golays estate. So again, much more pretentious, much more formulaic, not particularly low country in terms of the architectural influences, an awful lot of what Tidewater, Virginia is imagined to be during this period. Again, sort of main currents in architecture and design, and especially the sort of developing colonial revival tastes of the period get transported to low country estates that previously had substantially different architectural styles on them. Really nice examples of some of the way low country communities have to grapple with an entirely new class of people and think about what's happening to them. So for instance, these are just a couple clips from the Charleston News and Courier. Walker Inman is the brother of Doris Duke, so he's heir to the tobacco fortune, and he has a place called Greenfield Plantation that architecturally, in terms of landscaping, looks a lot like Wedgefield. It's designed by a different architect. He becomes one of these winter colonists here in Georgetown, and Georgetown has a brand new airport, and of course Walker wants to fly his new plane back and forth. So, no longer coming by train or boat. Mr. Inman says, millionaire sportsman and half-brother of Doris Duke Cromwell pilots the plane himself with the aid of a robot. The robot does most of the work, he says. He's talking about an early autopilot system. Again, very, very, very money, very sophisticated people. Cornelius Rathborn is a wealthy northerner. He's the heir to a timber fortune. He buys a place called Beneventum that's still pretty intact, and I recently had the pleasure of visiting. And his friend from Yale, Paul Mills, buys the neighboring Windsor estate, and they both love to ride horses and play polo. Paul Mills has been on the U.S. polo team, so within no time, the Georgetown newspapers are talking about how the area is going to become a destination for winter polo, just like Aiken, and we'll probably have a steeplechase center somewhere not too far down the road. And of course, this never happens, but just the sort of, expectations and ambitions that people start talking about are really substantial change. So these are all images of plantation life at its height. And what I argue in the book, and I think the sources show very well, there's a sort of merging with what people think a southern plantation is, influenced by all sorts of ideas about the South and a lot of the romanticized nostalgia of the period, with upper-class contemporary pursuits. And even when people write historically about where country estates come from, that nostalgia sees the Old South as this kind of aristocratic society, a lot more like feudal Europe, and of course, it's a landed society, it's not industrialized, so there's this sort of conflating of European nobility and contemporary aristocrats and what, again, people think southern plantations were historically. What these people are mainly doing is carrying on the same sort of recreational activity and social activity that they're used to in the north, okay? So very fancy dress for hunting, you don't go out in coveralls, and you certainly don't use the same sort of old shotgun, you might, if you're relatively modest means here, very expensive guns, very expensive, well-trained, pedigreed dogs, and then this kind of social scene that is about dressing up and talking about issues of the day with people of the same social set. This is actually a 1932 image, I believe, of what's called the Carolina Plantation Society. It's still around today. So in the early 1930s, a handful of Charleston attorneys decide they need to foster better relations with these northern winter colonists, these winter residents, and they decide to form a society of plantation owners, these people that own these large estates for recreational purposes. Nobody who's trying to still farm for profit is a member. And they get together once or twice a year and talk, and there's still the organization is still around today. An awful lot of enjoying the Lowcountry, taking in the Lowcountry as a sort of distinctive cultural experience. So in addition to hunting, horseback riding, an awful lot of sort of sightseeing on rural roads, a lot of boating, taking advantage of the Lowcountry waterways. This is a cocktail party at Gibby Plantation at the far end of the Cooper River in 1936 that to my mind looks an awful like a cocktail party on any Long Island estate during the same period. But the other side of that is, these people are fascinated with the Lowcountry, okay? The idea of the Lowcountry is developing during this period. Charleston's tourism industry is beginning to develop. That's a second half of the 1920s phenomenon. There's an awful lot of publications on Charleston architecture and Lowcountry history and culture. They're fascinated with this region where there seems to be this landscape that's time-worn and strewn with these kind of aging grand houses that seem to reflect this great society that once thrived here. They're fascinated with the African-American population. Most of these counties, most of the rural Lowcountry is still 70 to 80% black. All the African Americans speak Gullah. Most native Southerners don't understand them very well, let alone if you're from New York and you're trying to communicate with them. This is a scene from a gathering at Medway Plantation in the Goose Creek neighborhood. The estate owners and their guests spend a lot of time just sort of observing African Americans. This is a group of African Americans who are living and working on the place who come to sing spirituals in the evening. So a sort of imbibing of the Lowcountry cultural traditions that are still very much rooted in place is part of this phenomenon. More scenes of plantation life. All of them really interesting and curious in their own right. What makes this phenomenon possible, again, this management of large land holdings for recreational purposes in this sort of social world, the African American population is crucial. They're not just a source of fascination, they're the labor force that makes this possible. So in addition to very inexpensive land, the fact that you've got an awful lot of African Americans that are still living in rural areas and don't have better opportunities elsewhere. Agriculture has collapsed. They're mainly farming their own land for subsistence. And so African American labor, which is very inexpensive by northern terms, is crucial to rehabilitating the landscape for recreational purposes, for guiding northern hunters and taking them to good hunting lands. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into rehabilitating the agricultural landscapes. Ducks are much more attracted to working rice fields where you can change out the water and you can plant rice and other crops for feed. So it's not, the matter of buying old lands and just sort of leaving them as they are. There's a tremendous amount of rehabilitative effort put into the landscape. Heck, a lot of work. I mean, this is all pre-mechanical. It's all dirty, mucky work. Lowcountry African Americans become crucial, not just because hunting is a kind of performance and it requires dogs and horses and everything, and so there's care and feeding of the animals and the need for assistance, but the lowcountry landscape is also, it's real easy to get lost in old rice fields once you get outside of the big house. Trained guides, the gentlemen, the African Americans who know the landscape like the back of their hands and are hunting on it themselves, they become crucially important to guiding northerners and actually getting them back at the end of the morning or whatever, because otherwise they'd be out in some rice field somewhere. So African American labor is hugely important. And what I argue in the book is that there's a window of time that supports this phenomenon. By and large, because of defense industry jobs during World War II and the war effort itself, there'll be an exodus of African American labor from these rural areas. And certainly that's not everyone, but most of the working age males and women leave during that period to come work in Charleston, come work at the Naval Yard, which is the major enterprise that's developed during that period, or go to northern cities. Many of them enlist in the military. So Claire Booth Luce, who's Henry Luce's wife, Henry's the publisher of Time, Life, and Fortune, they have a place called Mepkin at the northern end of the Cooper River, and they buy relatively late. They buy in '36, and Claire is a journalist who's pretty pugnacious, and she's beginning to get interested in politics. She eventually becomes a congresswoman and also ambassador to Italy. So she's got this wonderful telegram she sends to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1938, and she complains, look, your New Deal, all these New Deal policies, these work assistance programs, I can't get good plantation labor anymore. Men are making $2.50 a day working on road crews. How am I supposed to afford to keep up my place here? And so it's tongue in cheek. It's a ribbing. None of these people are fans of the New Deal. It's socialism from their point of view. So, but it also speaks to this larger problem. So what happens here is this plantation making boom really tapers off after the mid-1930s, and it basically ends with World War II. Now there's complex things that happen during World War II. Many of the people that have developed states in this region are fairly aged, and they pass on or they get too old to come regularly. Some plantation owners do serve in the war effort, not in a frontline capacity, but work for various military agencies. The other thing that happens is that the airplane and improved transportation, the upper class scatters. So whereas there is a very clear trajectory between New York and Florida and Aiken and Camden, Pineland, North Carolina, if you like golf, where there's a a sort of cohesive movement with the seasons up until World War II. That changes dramatically as airline travel becomes more common and it's easier to get to the Great West. It's easier to get to California. Claire and Henry, for instance, not only have Mepkin, but by the mid-40s they've purchased a place in Hawaii. They've got a country estate in Connecticut too. They're trying to balance these great responsibilities, and they're no longer regulating quite as they once did. So by the end of World War II, you get newspaper articles appearing in New York newspapers that speak about the Yankee invasion ebbing, okay, and the fact that this estate-making phenomenon has really tapered off. In some cases, Northerners are even willing to sell back to native Southerners, and there are some cases thereof, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. What you get, though, and this is one of the main points I make in the book, is for this region, this is the process that redefines plantations as places of leisure and elite activity in a way that obscures the actual history and sort of forces people to think of plantations in a way that's fundamentally different from most parts of the South and very consonant with the romanticized view of, Tara and Gone with the Wind sort of vision of the past. So this is a photo spread that appears in Life at the end of the 1930s. And the quote is, "Today, the big cash crop is rich Northerners who have come south and bought the plantations where Carolina aristocrats once lived and ruled. The Yankees come south in the winter to hunt, to relax, and to enjoy the feudal feeling of property which owning thousands of acres gives them." So here's, if you're a well-to-do business person, heir of Gilded Age fortune, this is a mode of status acquisition and entree to a kind of lifestyle that seems to have a rootedness in the past as well as connections with upper class social norms of the period. And all of the literature from this period, when the discussion is of plantations, it's not talking about those places that have begun to do truck farming and try to supply vegetables to urban markets. People are still trying to figure out what you can do agriculturally with low country land. And they're not talking about any of the states that are still trying to be productive. The discussion of plantations all revolves around these winter estates owned by moneyed people from afar. And so the sort of redefinition as well as the connotations that creates is really, really powerful and really important in terms of how plantations and what plantations were historically are remembered during this period. Just to wrap things up, so as the second Yankee invasion ebbs, the story of what happens to the estates that are created during this period takes many different forms. So some remain in the family and some are still held by descendants who buy and develop during this period today. Others are sold back to native Southerners who are using them for some recreational purposes, but very quickly also want to have more remunerative activity. Ranching becomes something that people are doing in this part of the state, dairying along the Cooper River. Quite a few end up being sold for development. So the example of Wedgefield, which is very, very accessible, is a pretty good example as coastal land becomes attractive to middle-class people after World War II and certainly during the 60s and 70s, the opportunity to have estates that are still accessible that can be developed as housing developments and for middle-class recreation becomes very attractive and fairly common. The other point that I'd make, though, is there's been a fair bit of scholarship on conservation in the Lowcountry, and so people like Virginia Beach and I think it's Virginia Holmgarden, I may be mispronouncing her name, have written about the conservation ethos in the Lowcountry and the fact that we have large expanses of land that's been protected for land conservation, wildlife conservation. That story hasn't been fully told, but I'm pretty convinced at this point that part of that is possible because these people buy up such large properties and then have to figure out what to do with them once they no longer use them for recreational purposes. So that's a complicated story. But for instance, part of Cape Remaining National Wildlife Refuge, that's former Sanity Club lands that they decided to donate to the federal government for tax purposes as well as the conservation activity. There's still a lot that's in private hands, but the extent of easements that have been established in some areas, the Ace Basin being a really good example, that reflects both the appreciation for the Lowcountry landscape and the wildlife of the region, but also the fact that as compared to North Carolina and Georgia, you just don't have the sort of diffusion of property ownership. You've got a state of large tracts that are held by a single person or a single family, and that creates possibilities that simply don't exist anywhere else. So thank you very much for listening. Again, I really appreciate you having me, and I want to thank Bob for organizing this, and I'm happy to answer questions. I find this endlessly fascinating and love to talk about it.
That's wonderful. Really, my husband was born on a plantation in Cherokee in Tennessee, and 3 or 4 years ago they wanted to meet the descendant because he was in the family for 300 years, and we thought it'd be a bunch of stuffy multi-millionaires come, and of course they were wonderful, and it was really a lot of fun. But you covered so much, but do you know any price that would astound us that what they would pay, like $40,000 for thousands of acres or more?
So the land prices look very inexpensive to Northerners. There's a wonderful story, Jim Clark, who I see in the audience may know this, but there's a wonderful story. Theodore Ravenel is one of the last South Carolinians who continues planting on the Combahee River, which is really the last place after the hurricanes of 1893 and 1911 that there's still commercial planting. And E.F. Hutton of the E.F. Hutton stockbroker in Fortune goes to settle with him, and I forget how much he's buying, but Hutton apparently says something, this is not written down, but it's so often repeated that I take it to be more or less true. And Hutton says, they sign the papers, and Hutton says, well, sir, I just want you to know you're a damn fool. This is why you Southerners can't get anywhere. I would have paid double for the land that I just bought from you. I hate to tell you, but you just, gave away X amount of dollars. And Ravenel apparently turns right back around and says, well, I'm in good company then, because I would have sold it to you for half of what you paid for it. So, again, if you think about what the trajectory of land has meant here in the Lowcountry, by the late teens, by 1920, certainly by 1930, Lowcountry families are desperate to sell. They not only have rice and Sea Island cotton collapse, but planters since the late 19th century. They're trying to drain former rice lands, see if you can do row crops there. They're trying to do cattle. There's lots of energy that's put into trying to figure out how to make Lowcountry land productive, and both because of structural factors in agricultural markets and the land itself, it just doesn't work. So Lowcountry people are really happy to unload. The line is, the standard line is that people tend to pay about $1 an acre. And my research, the examples that I know of, it's often $2.50 or even $5 an acre. But again, compared to if you're trying to put together 20,000 acres on Long Island or Connecticut, or, it's very inexpensive. And one of the things, an awful lot of the people that buy land during this period are financiers. They're people like Baruch who are involved in investment banking, or they're stockbrokers, and stockbroker is by far the most common occupation. Nobody foresees the crash of '29, but an awful lot of them by the mid-20s are, Baruch talks about this in his autobiography, a lot of them are really nervous about the stock market. Like, you know, these prices just don't make sense. They're very aware that speculation has gone through the roof. And so, you know, not only are they eager to have recreational opportunities, and that's part of the world they live in, but, you know, there's certainly a fair bit of conscious logic that says, look, land is, you know, that's a tangible asset. It's not on paper. I'm going to buy land here, and it's certainly not going to get any cheaper because it's already dirt cheap. It's only going to increase in value. So that's part of the calculus that some of these folks are using at least.
Some of the reading I've done about hobcall Baron. Baruch started acquiring that place in 1905. Took him 2 years to acquire all of it. He paid an average of $3.15 an acre. But the going price for the land was $1.65 an acre. But they couldn't get anybody to buy it. But Baruch wanted it, and he wanted it now, so he paid them a fabulous price, $3.15 an acre, and then gave them a short period of time to vacate it and turn it over to him, which seems like highway robbery on both sides to us today.
Right. But at the time, I mean, this is part of the story. So there's a lot of sectional rhetoric, and, you know, Lowcountry people talk about rich Yankees. They make fun of Wall Street planners. But it's a pretty symbiotic relationship in the sense that it serves each other's needs pretty well. So there's certainly...
Even at that same point in time, Atlantic Coast Lumber Company had virtually denuded Waccamaw Neck. You know, there were no trees. The only trees left were great big oaks near the big houses. And the rest of the land looked like a freshly timbered lot. And so there was, dollar-wise, there was nothing left.
Right.
Southerners had gotten all they could off of it, and they were looking to unload it to somebody.
Exactly. Yeah, well put.
Back up his estimate of land costs. Billy Beach bought Rice Hole, which went from Wynyard Bay all the way to South Santee River at that time for $3 an acre. I heard that, you know, from the people that knew it. I was a kid in that neighborhood.
One of the projects that, I mean, could be done that I did not do, I mean, most of my sources come from contemporary newspaper reports. There's quite a lot of personal paper collections from either Southern families that sold or well-to-do Northerners that bought and developed. But, you know, it would be useful for somebody to go through the local deed research and look systematically at acquisition prices and see how that varies both within the state and over time. I mean, that wouldn't be that hard to do. I simply haven't done it.
But the other side of that story is the timber on that land was worth more than $3 an acre.
Sure. Yeah, almost all of this land has been timbered. So, you know, when I look at the prehistory of the states, trying to track them through, you know, they've stopped planting rice in the 1890s, then they sell the timber, and then it's just sort of there. So when somebody makes an offer for recreational purposes, man, that's a happy day. It's a very good moment.
We'll do one more question, and then we'll need to finish up.
Okay, yeah, you've done an excellent job. One thing I do want to bring in is Ayers property. The land that was after the Civil War that was actually bought and shared through the African American, and was shared through family units where you didn't have separate lines. It's called Ayers property, and a lot of it now, for many, many years, has been losing an Ayers property in one lump, because even those individual owners from the family, you could just buy one and take out all. And so I think I credit Emory Campbell in Penn Center to actually start the people awareness. That DeFosky is a perfect example, that this is still going on in African American land ownership.
No, that's absolutely true, and that's really one of the big historical phenomena that needs a serious study. It has tremendous relevance to the present because those are assets that have not been fully claimed by heirs. I mean, one of the points that I make in the book is that, and I don't know how much, one of the points I make in the book is that land acquisition of this scale by wealthy Northerners deprives African Americans of the opportunity to acquire land that, you know, might have given them a degree of economic self-sufficiency at a moment when that would have improved their status significantly. Now, you know, Southerners are white Southerners, planter families are very reluctant to sell even the long-standing laborers that have been on those lands for generations. I don't quite understand why that is, but it's pretty clear. I mean, there's not much effort to break up lands into small tracts and sell them to African Americans. Now, because of disenfranchisement, I'm not sure how much land ownership would have meant 1910, 1920. I mean, African Americans have been stripped of any kind of political influence here because of the Constitution of 1890. 1890? 95. 95, Tillman's Constitution. But, so, yeah, I mean, it's a complex story. The heirs property phenomenon is really one of the causes that needs further attention in the contemporary South.
Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you.